Hello everyone, it's Mark Goodacre here. Welcome to the NT Pod, the podcast all about the New Testament and Christian origins. It's episode 17, and today we're going to be looking at Paul's conversion on the Damascus Road. It's one of the things we all know about Paul's story, isn't it? That he had a dramatic experience on the Damascus Road. When in Paul classes I ask people right at the beginning what they already know about Paul, you can guarantee that one of the first things that those who have heard of him before will say is that he had a conversion experience on the Damascus Road. If you don't know the story, what happens is Paul is heading from Jerusalem to Damascus, where he's going to go and persecute Christians. And while he's on the journey, he has a vision of Jesus. And Jesus says to him, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" And it's a dramatic turnaround for Paul. He realizes that everything that he's been doing in this zealous persecution of Christians is completely wrong. And he turns around and he becomes not any longer the persecutor of the church, but its greatest apostle. It's such a major turnaround that it kind of lends itself to religious discourse as being the archetypal conversion experience. People even talk about a Damascene experience or a Damascus Road experience. You'll hear people saying, well, when I was converted, it wasn't a Damascus Road type experience. But I'm going to put a slight spanner in the works there and ask, first of all, was it a conversion? And second, was it on the Damascus Road? Let's take the business of the Damascus Road first. How do we know that Paul was converted on the road to Damascus? Well, Luke, in Acts of the Apostles, tells us this 3 times. The story is told in its first and fullest in chapter 9, and then it happens again in Paul's speech in Acts chapter 22, and then again in Acts chapter 26. And on all 3 occasions, Paul makes clear that he was journeying from Jerusalem to Damascus, and he was nearing Damascus when the thing happened to him. The reason that I just raise a slight question mark against it is that it's very common in Luke's writing to have really key events happen while people are going places. It's a kind of literary motif that you get in Luke's writings. So think about Luke's Gospel. Acts and Luke are written by the same person. Think about Luke's Gospel. The most famous parable that Luke has Jesus tell in his gospel is the Good Samaritan, which takes place on a road. You've got a Samaritan who's on the road from Jerusalem to Jericho, or the other way around. It's difficult to tell exactly which direction it's supposed to be, but you have that happening on a road. Think about the most famous resurrection story. It happens on the road to Emmaus in Luke chapter 24. There's something about the way that Luke likes to envisage key events happening, that he describes them happening on roads while people are journeying from one place to another. Perhaps the author of these books himself was a big traveller, and things always happened. Major things happened while people were on the way from one place to another. And it happens also in Acts of the Apostles. It's not just in the Gospel that key things happen on the road. In fact, loads and loads of the major action in Luke's Gospel and in Acts of the Apostles happens on roads. So think of the story, for example, of the Ethiopian eunuch. Again, it's while he's travelling, and so much so that when the Ethiopian eunuch wants to get baptized, they have to stop and get themselves, find a little bit of water near the road that they're travelling on. This isn't to say that Luke is kind of making this stuff all up out of whole cloth. I'm just talking about the kind of literary creation of the story, the way that he crafts things. He likes to talk about these things as happening on journeys from one place to another. Perhaps it's because he sees the whole Christian walk as in some way a kind of journey, a kind of way. I mean, he even calls the early Christian movement the way for lots of these early chapters in Acts of the Apostles. We can get a little bit of help here from Paul's own writings, because if you skip across to Galatians and chapter 1, Paul does describe his own conversion experience there, and in that chapter he does mention Damascus. He does talk about having gone to Damascus. So there is that city there that is important in Paul's own story. It's just that I think there's something about the literary crafting of that story which is very much a kind of special Lucan thing. So much for the location, but what about the actual substance? What about Paul's actual conversion? It was a conversion, right? He is someone who turns around from one way of doing things to a completely different way of doing things. He turns away from his previous life and now embraces the faith of Jesus. Well, yes, of course that is all true, but the area where we have to be a little bit careful here is if we think that conversion means that Paul is somehow converting from one religion to another religion, say from Judaism to Christianity, then that's clearly wrong, isn't it? I mean, Paul doesn't stop being a Jew when he has his experience of Jesus on the Damascus Road, does he? Does he ever even call himself a Christian in his works? He doesn't. And in fact, when he's really pressed, he is absolutely insistent on the importance to his identity of his Judaism. He talks about being a Hebrew of Hebrews, an Israelite. He talks about being from the tribe of Benjamin. He really wants to underline that his Jewish heritage is absolutely solid. It's certainly not something that he feels he's turned away from in any sense at all. For him, Jesus' coming fulfills the life that he has had in Judaism. Yes, he's got a kind of new life. He's got a life that he regards as being in Christ, and the believer's life is in Christ too. But it's not really a conversion from one religion or from one particular kind of state of religiosity to another. I mean, what then does Paul call this? Does he, if he doesn't say that it's a conversion, what does he call it? Well, when he's writing about it himself, he uses a couple of terms that help us to understand clearly how he conceptualized it. One of them is the term call. He saw this, what happened, as a call from God. If you look at Galatians 1 in particular, God has called him to his service, to follow him through Christ and to proclaim Christ. And in doing that, he's seeing himself really in that kind of Old Testament Hebrew Bible tradition of the prophet who is called. And if you read the Old Testament prophets, you'll often find that they have a kind of narrative of their call where they're pulled out of their everyday existence and turned around, and something kind of dramatic and different happens. So there is that kind of conversion element, but it's not a conversion from one thing to another. It's a call to a new vocation, and that's really how Paul conceptualizes the thing. It's worth noticing also something that we've talked about before on the NT pod, which is that Paul sees this key moment in his life, the call on his life, as being the moment where he experiences the resurrected Jesus. It's the moment where he sees Jesus. And when he talks about this turnaround, he always describes it in terms of having seen Jesus. Have a look at 1 Corinthians 9, have a look at Galatians 1, have a look at 1 Corinthians 15. He thinks about the key turnabout as where he sees Jesus, where he sees the resurrected Jesus. And Luke reflects that in Acts of the Apostles in chapter 9, because you have Paul having that vision of Jesus, but he doesn't describe it quite the way Paul does as an actual kind of resurrection experience. So what's the importance of these observations, if any? Well, I think for one thing, it's important to have a look at Acts of the Apostles always alongside Paul's own epistles. It is important to see what Paul himself says. I mean, I'm not one of these people that thinks that you should ignore Acts of the Apostles, but I do think that it's always right to begin with Paul himself. He's much closer to the events, of course, and it's, from the horse's own mouth, as it were, whereas Acts is written much later on. So I think that's an important reminder. But also, in terms of the terminology about call, and bear in mind that Luke also doesn't use that term conversion. I mean, he kind of sees it as Jesus calling Paul as well. In terms of that, it just helps to remind us of the importance of seeing Paul as a first century Jew within Judaism, and it helps us to think through the ways in which he stands in that Jewish tradition in which he's been brought up, how he's grappling with it throughout, and it helps us to avoid seeing him as some kind of Christian who has already got fully formed in his own mind the whole sort of Christian doctrine that is going to evolve over the centuries that come after him. So I think it helps us to get historically grounded when we use the right kind of terminology. I mean, I don't want to get too anxious about getting the terminology here exactly right. I mean, it could be okay to use the language of conversion, and many scholars do, as long as you recognise that this isn't the terminology that Paul or Luke are themselves using. It's our terminology and it's our way of describing what's going on in the texts. And I think it's important to look at the way that the texts themselves describe things, because sometimes that gives us a whole extra layer of understanding of what's going on. But we might well say, well, look, is Paul a figure a bit like, by analogy, someone like John Wesley, who has this statement that he will live and die a member of the Church of England, in spite of the fact that very clearly by his death he has already begun the process that's going to end up creating and sustaining the Methodist Church. I mean, one could definitely say that Paul has already set in motion all of the things that are going to help towards Christianity becoming its own religion separate from Judaism. But that's a kind of second level question, and it's something which isn't specific to the question we've been asking here today about Paul's conversion and his call. Well, thanks very much for listening to the latest episode of the NT Pod. You can find me on the web at podacre, podacre.blogspot.com. You can Google for Mark Goodacre, Google for the NT Pod, or you can find me on Duke University's iTunes U. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you soon. Oh, and as Columba would say, one more thing. There's a new podcast out on the Hebrew Bible. It's by Christopher Hurd of Pepperdine University, and it's called the Higgaion Podcast. You'll find it at www.herdworld.com/Higgaion. If you can't spell all of that, then just Google for Higgaion, which is Higgaion, and there's already several episodes out. And they're only 5 minutes or so long, so even shorter than the NT Pod. And he's aiming to produce a couple every week, and they're well worth listening to. There's lots more podcasts available on the Bible, and I've made a list of them over on my NT Gateway site. Just go to ntgateway.com and look for the section on podcasts. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you soon.